Hello, Bellevue. Good to be with you again for another Bible lesson. I've been waiting for the makeup artist to get here, but apparently they forgot to order the makeup artist. Dylan offered me a mask. He said that would probably be best, but we'll go with what we've got, and I hope you enjoy it. Before I start, I want to offer some thanks to the guys around here who make all this possible, to Dylan, who records all this and edits the bad stuff out, and to Kayla, who provides all the slides that you see, and to Daniel for his work and coordinating all this, and we're really appreciative of them. I also want to thank Roger for giving us an excellent lesson last week. The story of the defeat of the prophets of Baal on Mount Carmel is one of my favorite stories, probably one of your favorite stories. It's one of the most famous stories in the Bible, and it just shows the power of God. And Roger did an excellent job bringing that to us last week. Now today we're going to look at what I call the ascent of the successor. Now we don't know how old Elijah was. It's not revealed to us in the Bible, but apparently God has determined that it is time for Elijah to move on. And before he does, he wants to make sure that he has a successor in place. Now, succession planning is something we want to talk about a little bit here. And here's a definition of succession planning on the slide. It's a process for identifying and developing new leaders who can replace old leaders when they leave or retire or die. And this makes sure that the organization is positioned well for the future. Now, in 1787, our founding fathers who framed the Constitution, they knew the importance of succession planning. So they included in the Constitution a clause on succession, Article 2, Section 1, because they recognized the potential that a president may not be able to fill out his complete term, and so they needed a successor to him. So they made the vice president first in line for succession. But strangely enough, they allowed Congress to make laws for cases in which neither the president or the vice president were able to serve. Now, this became quite controversial, and over the years, there have been 3 presidential succession acts by Congress, and there have been 3 amendments to the Constitution to define succession. The 25th Amendment was ratified in 1967, and it's the final word on succession until the Constitution is changed again. Now, this Presidential Succession Act has actually been invoked 9 times in our history. And you think about that, that's 20% of the time we've had to replace a president. 8 times because of deaths and once because of resignation. So succession planning in our government is very important. But succession planning is important in all phases of our life. We see succession plans emphasized not only in government, but we see it in business, we see it in sports, we see it in the church. We know that the elders are always thinking about successors, and we know they're encouraging deacons to always think about their successor. And I think we can all agree that Last Leaders is one of the great programs we have for succession planning in the church, as we train young men and women to be leaders when their time comes. And so that's a great program as well. God knows all about succession, and he empowers his people to carry out his mission and to pass it on. When one prophet departs, another prophet emerges. And Jesus, even in John 16, Jesus says, I'm going to leave, but when I leave, a helper is going to come, and that's the Holy Spirit. And so we see Jesus understood a successor as well. Now we're going to look at 3 points today regarding the ascent of the successor to Elijah, and his name is Elisha. So the first point is the successor commits fully to the mission. Whoever you choose to be your successor has to understand the mission and commit to that mission. So let's look at the text of this morning, 1 Kings 19, verses 19 through 21. So he departed from there and found Elisha, the son of Shaphat, who was plowing with 12 yokes of oxen in front of him, and he was with the 12. Elijah passed by him and cast his cloak upon him. And he left the oxen, and he ran after Elijah and said, "Let me kiss my father and my mother, and then I will follow you." And he said to him, "Go back again, for what have I done to you?" And he returned from following him and took the yoke of oxen and sacrificed them and boiled their flesh with the yokes of the oxen and gave it to the people, and they ate. Then he arose and he went after Elijah and assisted him. So we're introduced here to Elisha. It's interesting, his name means God saves. Very similar to Joshua, whose name meant God is my salvation. And we're going to see a lot of similarities between Elisha and Joshua. Now, Elisha was a farmer, and apparently he was a wealthy farmer. He had 12 yoke of oxen. Now, a yoke is when two oxen are paired together. They each have a yoke on their neck, and they're paired together. So 12 yoke, he had 24 oxen, and he was working with one of the yokes. Now, he recognized immediately when Elijah asked him to come with him that the importance of that honor, and he was willing to enter into service for God and service for Elijah, but he wanted to bid his family goodbye first, and so he was allowed to go back. Elijah allowed him to go back, and he threw this big party. He killed the yoke of oxen that he was with, and he threw a big party, burned his plow, and he demonstrated clearly that he was leaving the old life behind, and he was moving on with the new life. Now, this kind of reminds me a little bit of Luke 9, when several followers came to Jesus and wanted to follow him. And each time, Jesus told them they had to leave everything and they had to follow him immediately. And one said, "Can I go back and tell my family goodbye?" And Jesus said, "No, you have to follow me immediately." So we see a little difference here when Elisha asked Elijah, "Can I go tell my family goodbye?" And Elijah said, "Yes, you can." But so Jesus told those who wanted to be followers, "You must follow me immediately." We see there's a difference in following a prophet and following the Son of God. If you follow the Son of God, he has to take precedence over everything. He demands immediate obedience, and he demands wholehearted allegiance. We have to put everything aside to follow Jesus. So when Jesus calls us, it's a little bit different than when Elijah called Elisha. So we see he did allow him to go home. But we see that Elisha abandoned everything and took up this prophetic calling. And then he began to follow Elisha. He talked about assisting him, and we see he became much more than that. He became Elijah's companion. In fact, in 2 Kings 2:12, he calls him father and shows the very intimate bond that the two held. Now, Elijah always complained about being alone, and he complained to God about he was the only one and he was alone. Well, now he's not alone. He has his assistant with him to follow him, and so that Elijah can train him up and teach him up and get ready to take over his work. Again, here's a similarity to Joshua, as Joshua was Moses' assistant, and we see now Elisha becoming Elijah's assistant. He's training for the role of prophet that Elijah has. Now, let's look at the next point. The successor requests God's power to complete the mission. And our text here is 2 Kings 2, verses 6 through 12, beginning of that verse. Then Elijah said to him, "Please stay here, for the Lord has sent me to the Jordan." But he said, "As the Lord lives, and as you yourself live, I will not leave you." So the two of them went on. 50 men of the sons of the prophets also went and stood at some distance from them as they both were standing by the Jordan. Then Elijah took his cloak and rolled it up and struck the water, and the water was parted to one side and to the other, till the two of them could go over on dry ground. When they had crossed, Elijah said to Elisha, "Ask what I shall do for you before I am taken from you." And Elisha said, "Please let there be a double portion of your spirit on me." And he said, "You have asked a hard thing. Yet if you see me as I am being taken from you, it shall be so for you. But if you do not see me, it shall not be so." And as they went out and talked, behold, chariots of fire and horses of fire separated the two of them. And Elijah went up by a whirlwind into heaven. And Elisha saw it, and he cried, my father, the chariots of Israel and its horsemen." So we see Elijah is kind of going on a farewell tour here. He goes to Bethel, he goes to Jericho, and he goes across the Jordan River. And everywhere he goes, there are prophets. So apparently Elijah is saying goodbye to the prophets, and he's introducing the prophets to Elisha, that he's going to take his place. And maybe there's some sort of school or some sort of collection of the prophets in each of these places that he goes. Now it's interesting to note here that 3 times in verse 2, verse 4, and verse 6 of this chapter, Elijah tries to shake Elisha, and Elisha will not leave him. It kind of reminds me of the story of Naomi and Ruth. And many scholars believe that this is a test, that Elijah is really testing Elisha. He offers him maybe a way out 3 different times and says, "You stay here, I'm going on alone." And Elisha will not do it. Elisha will follow Elijah. He has committed fully to following Elijah. It's kind of a question we put to us. I mean, when we are questioned, when we are asked to leave Jesus behind, we have to persist, we have to persevere, and we have to continue to follow him. Now, Elisha asked also for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. Now, he recognized that he would need a lot of help to carry on Elijah's role and to fulfill God's calling. Now, in the world, if you ask somebody, well, what do you want your inheritance to be? We might say, well, how about money? Or how about property? Or how about goods? Or something like that. But Elisha asked for none of that. He asked for a double portion of Elijah's spirit. He wanted to be consumed by the same spirit that Elijah was consumed, but he wanted twice as much. He knew he would need it. Now, this probably refers to Deuteronomy 2, where the firstborn always gets a double portion. And it's like Elisha saying, "I am your firstborn son, and I want a double portion, but I'm going to need a double portion. I'm going to need all the help that I can get. I'm going to need Elijah's spirit. I'm going to need God's spirit. I'm going to need all the help I can get to do this job." So we see that Elisha received this double spirit, making him a very powerful prophet. Now, an interesting story here is Elijah is taken up. As I go back and read this, I kind of think, oh, Elijah was taken up by chariots of fire and chariots of horsemen, and that's not really the case. The chariots separate Elisha and Elijah is actually taken up in a whirlwind, not taken up into the chariot. So I have to go back and read that to remember that. And Elisha called out the chariots of Israel and its horsemen and recognized that this is the power of God here. We've seen in the past, the chariots of the Lord's army, and we've seen the fire. We just saw the fire on Mount Carmel. And so we see that these two things represent the power of God. And so Elijah is here in the presence of the power of God. Now, one thing about Elisha getting this double portion is we look upon his prophecy, his ministry. We see that the Bible actually records that Elisha did twice as many miracles as Elijah did. And maybe that's just what's recorded, but we see that he was actually granted this double portion. And we see the miracles he performed. We see the things that he does later on. Now, the prophets who were there across the Jordan saw Elijah taken up. And we see that Elisha took off his own clothes and he put on the cloak of Elijah that he had left behind. And it's kind of a symbolic throwing off of the old and a picking up of the new, that now Elisha is the prophet, is God's man. So this brings us to the third point. The successor is confirmed by a sign to begin the mission. So now that we see that Elijah's been taken up, let's pick up the reading again in 2 Kings 2, verse 12. And he saw him no more. And he took up the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him, and he went back and stood on the bank of the Jordan. Then he took the cloak of Elijah that had fallen from him and struck the water, saying, "Where is the Lord, the God of Elijah?" And when he struck the water was parted to one side and to the other, and Elisha went over. Now when the sons of the prophets who were at Jericho saw him opposite them, they said, "The spirit of Elijah rests on Elisha." And they came to meet him, and he bowed to the ground before him. So these events, we see the Elijah taking up, the throwing off of the cloak, to putting on a new cloak. It's kind of the passing of the spiritual baton, or the passing of the prophetic baton, if you will. The responsibility has now been passed from Elijah to Elisha, and it's been validated in three ways. Now, the first is that Elisha, just like Joshua, parted the Jordan River and headed back toward Jericho, reversing the steps that they used to go over when Elijah parted the Jordan River. And so now Elisha has done the same thing. And the company of prophets who are there, they see him do this. They see him cross on the dry ground and return the same way that they went. So they see the symbol there that now Elisha is the new Elijah. He has taken up the prophecy of Elijah. And they showed reverence to Elisha because they recognized that he was called by God. He was chosen by God. Now, second, when he went to Jericho, the men of Jericho had said that there was something lethal in the water that was causing people to die, causing women to miscarry. And we know historically in Jericho, when Joshua, here's Joshua again, in Joshua 6, Joshua put a curse on Jericho. Anyone who tried to rebuild it, they would suffer punishment. And we see in 1 Kings 16 that Hiel tried to rebuild Jericho, and his firstborn and lastborn son died, going back to Joshua's curse. So the people of Jericho feel like they're living under this curse, and now their water is tainted. Their water is lethal. So Elisha takes a jar of salt, and he puts the jar of salt into the water, and that takes the curse away from the water. And now they have fresh, healthy water to drink there in Jericho. So they witness a second miracle here. And thirdly, as Elijah travels back to Bethel, some boys came out of the city to ridicule him and started calling him, "Go up, you bald head." Now, as much as I snicker at this and think, well, you know, they're going to get what they deserve, that's not really the point here. Remember, as they go back into Bethel, this is a land of idolatry, and these young men are more than likely idolaters. They are visiting the prostitutes of the of the altars to Baal and Asherah. And they recognize that Elisha is a man of God, and he has come to overturn all of this. And so they're actually mocking him. They're actually mocking God when they say this, and the things they say and the things that they do. So Elijah brought down God's judgment on these mockers, and she-bears came out of the woods and attacked the boys and killed them. They were not killed because they insulted his lack of hair. They were killed because they were mocking God, and they were mocking God's representative. God will always have the last word. So we see that Elisha he's a true successor to Elijah, and he begins his ministry in Israel and the surrounding nations, and he will bring the blessings of God's grace and show God's judgment. Elisha reminds us of Elijah a lot, but he also reminds us of Jesus, because he's kind of pointing toward one who will come later, whose ministry is much greater than that of a prophet. Jesus was anointed at the Jordan River. We see some similarities there. Jesus had a command over water. Some more similarities. But Jesus was much different than either Elijah or Elisha. Elisha's ministry is kind of Messiah-like. We'll see in the coming chapters that Elisha performs many more miracles, and most of those are miracles of compassion. Just like Jesus. Many of Jesus' miracles were miracles of compassion. So we see a lot of similarities here, how Elisha is kind of pointing to Jesus, to the one who is to come. He kind of points to the rest of the story of the Scripture. It kind of inspires us, and it tells us to trust our God. Trust our God. He is sovereign. He is in control. He is the master of this story here, and his Son is at the center of all this. It's all part of God's plan. All right, so we'll finish here with saying we see that Elisha takes up the prophetic baton, as you will, with the spirit of Elijah, and how this story connects us to Jesus. And so we'll see now that Elijah will begin his ministry as a prophet prophet of God. You know, as I was preparing this lesson, I kind of reflected back. Recently, we had a death of a couple of grand ladies in our congregation, Dora McGill and Dottie Suggs. And as I was thinking about that, I remember we came to Bellevue, my family came to Bellevue over 40 years ago. And we made friends fast with people in our age group, and we made fast friends. I mean, we still have many of those friends today. Friends that are a very important part of our life. But when we came here, we also got to know those who were a little bit older than us, either through the visitation programs or through Sunday schools or through fellowships or through dinners. We got to know people like George and Dora McGill, and Romy and Dottie Suggs, Donnie and Evelyn Keaton, Ned and Dorothy Solomon, Jim and Ima Lincoln, Gary, Janet Folks. I could go on and on. I could just go on and name you the people that we met. They encouraged us. They taught us. They inspired us. And as Christians, we enjoy the benefits of those faithful brothers and sisters of previous generations who handed down the faith to us, the next generation. You know, the gospel did not die in Jerusalem after the Christians were dispersed. The gospel did not die. The gospel will not die at Bellevue because of people who kept the faith. People like that who shared it with others and passed it down to the next generation. So here we are. It's our responsibility now. We bear that same responsibility. It is up to us to pass the gospel down to come in generations and to reach out to those who don't know the gospel. We are part of God's succession plan. That should be our legacy. We will continue to pass the gospel along, to come in generations in the church and reach out to those not in the church. We are part of God's succession plan. Thank you for listening, and I ask all of you to stay safe and consider others. Thank you.